The stage lights burned bright, the kind of lights that make your heart race even if you pretend you are not afraid. Backstage, Seamus O'Connell stood perfectly still, his fingers wrapped tightly around the worn wooden neck of his instrument. It was older than him, older than his father, maybe even older than his grandfather. A traditional Irish fiddle, passed down through generations of his family, polished smooth by decades of hands that had played not for fame, but for survival, joy, and memory. Seamus was only 16, but his eyes carried a weight that suggested a much longer journey. He had grown up in a small village on the west coast of Ireland where the Atlantic winds howled like ghosts and the nights were filled with music instead of television. In his home, music was not a hobby. It was a language. His grandmother used to say that before the Irish had money, they had songs. Before they had power, they had rhythm. And before they had stages, they had kitchens, pubs, and firesides. But none of those places looked anything like this stage. The producer whispered his name. 5 seconds. Seamus closed his eyes and remembered the stone floor of his grandmother's kitchen, the smell of peat smoke, and the sound of her tapping her foot while he practiced as a small boy. She had died the year before, and this audition was for her. He walked forward. The audience applauded politely, the kind of applause that carries curiosity but no expectation. The judges glanced at his instrument, then at each other. One of them leaned forward and asked where he was from. Seamus answered simply, from County Clare, Ireland. Another judge smiled and asked what he would be playing. He said traditional Irish music. There was a pause, just long enough to feel uncomfortable. Traditional Irish music was not exactly what this show was known for. One judge raised an eyebrow and asked if he thought that kind of music could compete on a global stage. Seamus hesitated, then answered honestly. He said he didn't know. But he knew it deserved to be heard. The room quieted. Cameras zoomed in. Somewhere in the audience, a few people crossed their arms, ready to be impressed or disappointed. Then Seamus lifted the fiddle to his chin. The first note was soft. Almost too soft. A single sound that floated into the massive theater like a question. Some people leaned forward, unsure if that was all. Then came the second note, then the third, weaving together into a melody so old it felt like it had been waiting centuries to be played in that room. Within seconds, the softness transformed. His bow moved faster. The melody twisted and turned, rising and falling like waves crashing against cliffs. The rhythm tapped into something primal, something older than pop music, older than trends, older than the show itself. Feet in the audience began to move without permission. Hands started tapping on armrests. A judge's smile faded into surprise. Then the twist came. From the side of the stage, without warning, a deep rhythmic stomp echoed through the theater. Another performer stepped into the light. Then another. And another. 3 Irish dancers, dressed simply, their feet striking the stage with explosive precision. The crowd gasped. This was no solo act. This was a storm. Seamus did not look back. He played harder. The dancers moved like lightning, their feet blurring as the rhythm intensified. The music grew faster, bolder, almost defiant. The audience erupted into cheers halfway through the performance, something that rarely happened. One judge stood up unconsciously, hands covering their mouth. But the biggest shock was still coming. Just when the music reached what felt like its peak, Seamus stopped playing. The silence hit like a slap. Then, from the back of the theater, a low haunting sound emerged. It was the Uilleann pipes, an ancient Irish instrument, played by Seamus's older sister, Aoife, who had lost her job during the pandemic and nearly given up music altogether. The camera caught her face as she played, tears streaming down her cheeks. The fiddle returned, softer now, blending with the pipes. The dancers slowed, their movements suddenly graceful instead of explosive. The music told a story without words. A story of leaving home. Of ships sailing away. Of families broken by hunger and hope. Of immigrants who crossed oceans carrying nothing but songs in their hearts. In the audience, people cried without fully understanding why. Many of them were Americans whose ancestors had once come from Ireland, Italy, Africa, Asia, and beyond. They felt something familiar in that music. Loss. Strength. Survival. As the tempo built again, the dancers returned with even greater force. The pipes roared. The fiddle screamed with joy and sorrow intertwined. When the final note hit, it felt like the entire theater exhaled at once. There was a fraction of a second of silence. Then the room exploded. The audience leapt to their feet, screaming, clapping, stomping. The judges stood, all of them, some shouting, some wiping tears. One judge slammed the golden buzzer without hesitation. Gold confetti rained from the ceiling as Seamus froze in disbelief, his hands still clutching the bow. He hadn't expected this. None of them had. Backstage, producers stared at monitors, stunned. Social media lit up instantly. Clips of the performance spread across the internet within minutes. People who had never searched for Irish music before were suddenly typing frantic comments, asking what that sound was, where it came from, and why it made them feel so much. In the interviews afterward, one judge admitted they had underestimated him. Another said they had just witnessed history. Seamus struggled to find words. He said the music belonged to his people, not to him. He said it was older than the show and would exist long after it. But the twists didn't end there. A week later, Seamus received a letter from an American man in his 70s. The man wrote that his grandparents had fled Ireland during the famine and that he had grown up hearing stories but never truly feeling connected. After watching that performance, he felt something click. He ended the letter by saying, "Thank you for giving me back a piece of myself." More messages followed. From Irish immigrants. From people with no Irish blood at all. From musicians who had abandoned traditional music because they thought the world didn't care. Suddenly, traditional Irish talent wasn't niche anymore. It was global. In the semi-finals, Seamus and his group returned with a riskier performance, blending ancient melodies with modern percussion. Critics doubted the choice. Purists worried he was betraying tradition. But when the performance aired, it shattered viewing records. The fusion didn't weaken the tradition. It amplified it. In the finals, standing under the brightest lights of his life, Seamus carried something new with him. Confidence. Not arrogance, but certainty. The certainty that authenticity could still win. They didn't win first place that night. They came second. And yet, when the results were announced, the applause for them was louder than for the winners. Because by then, the world already knew. This wasn't about a trophy. This was about revival. Within months, Seamus signed a global tour. Irish dance schools saw record enrollments. Traditional instruments sold out online. Children in America started learning reels and jigs instead of quitting music altogether. And somewhere, in a quiet Irish village, an old kitchen radio played a familiar melody while a grandmother's memory lived on. Sometimes the greatest shock to the world is not something new. It is something ancient, finally heard. Ending question for viewers.